By the seventh time through, nobody in the room was counting anymore. The studio was small, the kind of room that existed in the early 1960s before recording became a thing done in purpose-built facilities with isolation booths and multiple control rooms. A space assembled from necessity rather than design, with acoustic treatment that was partly professional and partly improvised, with equipment that worked because the people using it understood it well enough to work around what it couldn't do. The band sat in a rough semicircle, instruments held with the particular looseness that comes late in a session, after the formal attention of the early takes has given way to something more automatic. It was the early years of the Ike and Tina Turner Revue, before Proud Mary, before the major television appearances, before the songs that would define their legacy in wider cultural memory. They were a working act, building a catalog and a reputation in the circuit of clubs and theaters that ran through the American South and Midwest. And the recording sessions they did in those years were built in the same spirit as the performances. Fast, direct, designed to capture what the band did live, rather than construct something in the studio that the live version would then have to approximate. Ike had been running a Fool in Love for the past 2 hours. Not continuously, there were breaks between takes, moments when he stopped the band to adjust something in the arrangement, to change a tempo marking, to move a horn entrance by half a beat. But the song had not left the room. Every time the tape rolled, it was the same song. And every time the band finished, Ike listened to the playback for a few minutes and then said the same word. Again. The musicians had learned not to ask why. Over months of working with Ike, they had come to understand that again was not a judgment about what had been wrong with the last take. It was, more often, a signal that something in the previous take had been close to something Ike heard in his head and hadn't quite arrived there. The gap between what the tape had captured and what he was listening for was narrowing, but it had not yet closed. And until it closed, the session continued. Tina Turner had sung A Fool in Love the same way across the first 6 takes. Not the same in the sense of mechanical repetition. Each take had its own small variations, places where the phrasing landed slightly differently, moments where the voice had more or less room in a given measure. But the approach had been consistent. Full voice, the declarative attack she used on up-tempo numbers, the performance built from the outside in, confident, direct, commanding in the way that the song, as it was meant to be heard on a stage, required. She was 20 years old, approximately, and she had been performing with the Revue for 2 years. She had not grown up in a formal singing tradition, no classical training, no conservatory, no sustained apprenticeship in a gospel choir of the kind that shaped other voices of her generation. What she had was the raw material of the voice itself, which was extraordinary, and the particular education that comes from performing hundreds of nights in rooms where audiences are either with you completely or not with you at all, with no middle ground. The voice she had built in those 2 years was formidable in exactly the ways a voice needed to be formidable in the Revue. Powerful, consistent, capable of the kind of extended performance that the Revue's nightly schedule demanded. She could sing for 2 hours and still have something left at the end. She knew how to project into a room without monitors, how to sustain energy across a long set, how to deliver the same song night after night without it becoming routine. What she had not yet fully discovered was what the voice could do when all of that formidable technique was stripped away, when the professional armor of a practiced performance was too heavy to carry, and the voice, looking for another way, found a different kind of directness entirely. By the seventh take, she was tired in a way that the earlier takes had not made her. Not injured, not damaged, just depleted in the specific way that extended vocal work depletes, where the mechanisms of controlled performance become harder to maintain and the voice begins to seek a less effortful path. Some singers in this state flatten, some lose precision. Some fall back on habit in a way that makes the performance technically correct and emotionally hollow. What Tina Turner's voice did in that state was something else. Take 7 began the way the previous 6 had begun. The band finding the groove, the horns holding their position, the rhythm sections settling into the familiar tempo. Tina stepped to the microphone. And then, without deciding to do it, without planning it, she sang the first line differently. Not differently in a way that was immediately obvious to everyone in the room. It was not a dramatic departure from the approach of the previous takes. It was a small thing. A slight roughness in the attack on the opening phrase, where the previous takes had been smooth. A moment where the voice, instead of arriving at the note from above, the trained singer's approach, the approach that projects confidence and control, arrived from somewhere closer to the center of the sound, without the professional margin that the earlier takes had maintained. Ike, in the control room, leaned forward slightly. He had been listening for 2 hours to a performance that was excellent in every measurable way, and that had not yet arrived at the thing he was hearing when he heard the song in his head. He could not have described the gap in technical terms. It was not a timing issue, not a pitch issue, not a problem with the arrangement or the band or the recording chain. It was something more elusive. The difference between a singer performing a song about vulnerability and a singer who, in the moment of performance, was actually vulnerable. The first was craft, the second was something that craft alone could not produce. He didn't stop the take. The song continued, and Tina's voice continued to do the thing it had found in those first bars, not abandoning technique, but wearing it differently, using it as a floor rather than a wall, the precision still present but no longer in front of the emotion. The phrases she had sung cleanly in the previous takes now had a slight, ragged quality at the edges. Not sloppiness, but rawness, the sound of someone singing from inside the experience of the song, rather than from a position of command over it. The band felt it before they could have named it. The rhythm section settled fractionally, the way rhythm sections settle when the vocal in front of them has found something true and the music wants to match it. One of the horn players said later that he had stopped thinking about his part in the third verse and had simply listened. The first time in 7 takes that the song had pulled his attention away from the mechanics of playing it. When the take ended, Ike said nothing for a long moment. The room held the silence that comes after a recording that everyone in it knows, without discussion, was different from what preceded it. Not perfect in the way technical perfection is defined, but true in a way that perfection sometimes obscures. The tape reels continued to turn for a few seconds after the last note, and then Ike reached over and stopped them. He did not say, "again." What he said, after a moment, was something closer to a question than a statement, an observation about what the last take had done that the previous 6 had not, framed in the practical language he always used when talking about recordings. He said the vocal was sitting differently in the track. He said the arrangement had room around it that the earlier takes hadn't had. He said it was catching something. Tina heard this without fully understanding yet what had changed. She had been too inside the take to have the outside perspective the control room afforded. She knew the take had felt different. She had felt the slight roughness in her own voice, the places where the technical armor had thinned enough that the song got through it rather than being delivered through it. She had not known, while it was happening, whether that thinning was a flaw or a discovery. She knew now, from the absence of the words she had been hearing for 2 hours, that it was the second thing. What they had, in the end, was a recording that carried something the previous 6 takes did not, a quality that listeners, when the record was released, might not have been able to name but would have felt. The sense of a voice that was not performing its emotion so much as being unable to prevent it. A Fool in Love, as a song, was built around that particular emotional condition, the inability to stop feeling something that was making you suffer. 6 excellent takes had described that condition. The 7th had embodied it. For Ike Turner, the session was a confirmation of something he had understood intuitively since he first heard Tina sing, that the voice she possessed was not just powerful and consistent, the qualities that made her invaluable on a nightly touring schedule, but capable of a register that most powerful, consistent voices never accessed. A register that required, paradoxically, the suspension of the very control that made the voice powerful and consistent in the first place. He had run the session past the point of comfort, past the point where most producers would have taken the best of the earlier takes and called it done, because he was listening for something specific, not better technique, not a cleaner performance, but the moment when technique ran out and something underneath it surfaced. That moment had a sound, and he had been patient enough to wait for it. For Tina, the session planted something she would spend years returning to, not intentionally, not as a method she could consciously apply, but as a memory of what the voice could reach when everything it used to protect itself had been used up. It was not a place you could go to directly. You could only arrive there by the long route, through the performance, through the precision, through the professional command that was genuinely built and genuinely hers, and then past all of it into the stripped-down thing that the song was actually asking for. The recording they made that night became part of the catalog that defined the early Ike and Tina Turner Revue sound. Not the most famous thing they ever recorded, not the track that most people would name if you asked them about the Revue's legacy, but for the people who listened carefully, who heard the slight roughness in the vocal, the places where the voice arrived from somewhere unexpected, it was recognizably something other than a well-executed performance. It was a performance that had lasted long enough to become something true. That is what Ike Turner heard at 2 in the morning in a small studio after 7 takes of the same song. Not a mistake, not a flaw in the performance, but the sound of a voice that had run out of ways to protect itself and found in that unprotected place exactly what the song had always needed.